please welcome Adam Coffey.
Thanks, Pete, and thank you, NTCA, and everybody for having me here today. I am a Queenslander, I'll acknowledge that, but and have been for some 8 years now. But my wife and I spent a fair bit of time in the NT and Kimberley, probably more years there than we have where we are now. So it's home, and it's always good to come back and hard to leave again. So as Pete mentioned, I am a director and deputy chair on the board of Cattle Australia. We've spoken a bit about Cattle Australia this morning. But we're the peak body for grass-fed levy payers. And we haven't been in existence for a whole heap of time, but we're very, very enthusiastic and excited, I guess, about what we've achieved so far in terms of tackling critical issues on behalf of grass-fed levy payers, of which we all are one. So today I want to talk about emissions policy in Australia, and I guess relating specifically to livestock production from my point of view as a producer, and then also as an advocate for industry as the Deputy Chair of Cattle Australia. I'm going to talk about the current state of play around livestock emissions and how CA policy, we're trying to rewrite the narrative of cows from being, big bad one-way emitters to being part of the climate solution based on science. I want to talk about how modern climate science supports a rethink and that we're up against outdated policy, regulation and bias. At this point, I want to reiterate that this is no bid to get out of, further action around climate and emissions policy and doing our bit for climate change. I think it's a little bit of a sad indictment on society that when you, question the status quo around something like, emissions and livestock in this instance, that you can be labelled a climate denier or somebody that's trying to get out of doing their bit. That's certainly not the case, but understanding evolves over time, and we need to be cognizant of that fact. But ultimately, I want to make a case for change and, of course, hopefully inform and arm some of my fellow producers here in the room to advocate better on behalf of our great industry. So I guess I started to question the process around emissions accounting probably during the early days of our carbon neutral 2030 announcement, which was somewhat thrust on industry without a whole lot of sort of context and understanding around it. And as a grass-fed producer, I remember sitting out in the paddock and I'd listen to some of the early sort of advice around, how we're going to tackle this big goal on behalf of industry. And I remember a key determination from CSIRO at the time was, we've got to put more cattle on feed and we've got to end their big, bad, miserable methane emitting lives sooner. Now, while I fully, respect and the position of the grain-fed sector within our great industry, to me as a grass-fed producer, I sort of thought, we're missing a piece of the pie here. There's something not quite adding up. So, where do I point there? Not working? Down arrow would help. And I think I will skip straight across the next slide. So I guess I've got to start from basics a little bit. And, I want to acknowledge again that methane is a powerful warming gas. But it's important that we understand that ruminant livestock emissions are different from one-way fossil emissions. So up on the screen there, you'll see a chart there that's been pulled from the Australian Good Meat website. And that is trying to articulate, the biogenic carbon cycle, which most of you would be fairly well aware about. So cow eats grass, cow emits methane through the process of enteric fermentation. That methane then sits in the atmosphere for some 10 to 12 years before it's oxidised into CO2 and water. Now that CO2 component can be obviously recaptured through that process. So we talk about it as a cycle. This other chart I've chucked up here is really just talking about, I want to introduce the term about stock gases versus flow gases. So up the top there, you'll see the chart referring to stock gas. And all that's trying to say is that, so if we think about the difference between a carbon dioxide and methane, carbon dioxide is a long-lived climate pollutant. So on day one, you emit 1 unit of carbon dioxide. On day two, you emit another, and that adds to the one you had the day before, and so on and so forth. And those emissions are in the atmosphere for thousands of years. So in terms of our lifetime, they are there for good. Down the bottom is just illustrating that flow gas concept. So from a stable source of methane emissions, on day one you'll have 1 unit of methane. On day two you'll have another one, but it's not accumulating. It hasn't replaced, or it's basically replaced what was there before. So in terms of stable emissions profile, we need to think about the fact that gases are destroyed at roughly equal rates as they're created. So from a stable source of emissions, like a stable livestock herd, there's not necessarily a distinct warming increase, and that's comparative to the carbon dioxide stock sort of illustration above. So I've sort of spoken a bit about how CO2 and methane behave very differently in the atmosphere. What I want to talk about here is the warming effect of those emissions in the atmosphere. So here up on the screen there, you've got three different scenarios. You've got rising emissions, constant emissions, and falling emissions. And it's important to note, I suppose, under the rising emissions scenario, we have rising emissions of CO2, we've got rising emissions of methane. Down the bottom is illustrating what warming effect that has in the atmosphere. So the warming effect of that CO2, that curve is somewhat exponential. It keeps going up, and that relates to the accumulative nature of CO2 in the atmosphere over time, whereas the warming effect of methane, which is also increasing, is somewhat flatter. Under constant emissions of CO2 and methane, the warming effect of CO2 is still accumulating in the atmosphere, right? And it's been doing so for a long time. So that warming effect continues for some time, despite the fact that the actual emission is relatively stable. Where methane starts to differentiate, and if you think about that stock versus flow chart earlier, is that warming effect of those emissions in the atmosphere start to flatline. Over on the right there, we've got a scenario of falling emissions, and this is probably, I guess, with the stable and the falling emissions scenarios, what's interesting to our industry. So falling emissions of CO2 and methane, you'll notice that the warming effect in the atmosphere of the CO2 over time continues to increase. And again, that's to do with the accumulative nature and the historical nature of emissions. What's interesting under the scenario of falling emissions with a flow gas like methane is that at that point that you are then emitting less than you have historically emitted, you can offer a cooling effect within the atmosphere as such. So I guess between the stock versus flow charts and these ones, the important point here is that stable livestock emissions are cyclical. So from a stable herd, we're not necessarily adding to warming. And if we reduce methane, we can actually offer a global cooling effect. So I guess this leads into why greenhouse gas metrics are important. I don't want to spend a heap of time on metrics because it gets very, very complicated very, very quickly. I'll introduce a metric called GWP 100, and that's the GWP stands for global warming potential. And that's a metric that's been utilised around the world. It was developed some 30 plus years ago, and it's been accepted by most developed countries. It was developed under the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it's been utilised for countries to report the quantum of their emissions over time. The issue with GWP and GWP 100, is that in recent years there's been scientific acknowledgement that there are serious issues in there when it relates to short-term gases like methane. And I guess this is where it becomes interesting as a livestock sector. So IPCC have acknowledged their issues, and there are plenty of papers written about, around the issues. And the issues predominantly relate to the fact that GWP 100, so the 100 refers to a 100-year time frame, and there are discrepancies and miscalculations in terms of a short-lived pollutant and the pulse of those emissions within that 100-year time frame. But the key point here is that, and I put up this little blurb there on your left, and that's from an IPCC 6 assessment report that was written in 2021, and it basically states that expressing methane emissions using the currently widely accepted GWP 100 metric overstates the warming impact of a constant source of emissions by 300 to 400%. So when you think about how our methane emissions are accounted for in Australia annually, we're in a scenario where it's been scientifically acknowledged that our emissions are overstated by 3 to 4 times. But importantly, also, it understates the impact of a new methane source. And this is important, I guess, when you consider the cyclical nature of livestock emissions from a stable herd versus new emissions to the atmosphere from a fossil source, for instance. So they're being underestimated. So we're sort of getting a bit of a double whammy there. I should introduce a guy by the name of Miles Allen. So Professor Miles Allen is a climate scientist from Oxford University, and Cattle Australia hosted him in Canberra last year, and he came and spoke to a bunch of producers, a bunch of industry representatives, and he's been one of the scientists, I suppose, that was interestingly originally involved in the development of the GWP 100 metric, but has since come back to be very critical around where it is, and he's ultimately worried that we're not measuring the warming effect of emissions correctly. and therefore that excuse me, has ramifications for greater society. So just to reiterate what I'm saying here is that fossil methane is very different to biogenic methane from grass-fed sources. When fossil methane breaks down in the atmosphere, it adds another CO2 atom to the atmosphere, whereas biogenic methane doesn't. The CO2 released from biogenic livestock methane, when it breaks down, it's simply replacing CO2 removed from the atmosphere by the photosynthetic process of growing grass, which cattle eat. Now, that's a general statement. Those sort of scenarios will change in different production environments for sure. But this is sort of where we're headed and what we've got to try and understand. So again, I put this one in just to reiterate. It's not just me saying this. There are plenty of scientists questioning this. And what's interesting, I think, to Cattle Australia, when we've engaged the likes of Miles Allen, Dr. Bradley Ridout, who's a principal scientist with CSIRO, who I'll talk about in a minute, they've been at pains to say we're not advocates for your industry. We don't care. Well, that's probably a bit harsh. I guess they care, but they don't really care what we do here, because they're not advocating for the success of our industry. But they do acknowledge that scientifically there is perhaps a much better way that we could be looking at things. So the scientific community is increasingly questioning carbon neutral type targets, which rely on a GWP 100 accounting metric. So it's a serious issue, and we need to evolve. In the case of short-term gases like methane, GWP 100 is incorrectly predicting changes to radiative forcing, which is the forcing effect of gases in the atmosphere, which is ultimately the driver of climate change. So that's why I guess we have an interest in alternative metrics. There are plenty of different greenhouse gas metrics out there, developed by scientists and accepted under sort of IPCC and UNFCCC frameworks, and they're all trying to address, I guess, different things. And the key point that Miles made was that you as industry or even government are free to ultimately utilise whatever metric you want, as long as it's science-based, and there has to be consistency within your reporting. And I guess that's one issue when we talk about a GWP 100 metric that's been sitting there for 30 years, that there is an element of consistency that needs to be followed. So an alternate metric that we've looked at as livestock producers at Cattle Australia is called GWP star, and all that's trying to do, and Miles Allen was out here speaking a lot about it, you might have seen a little bit about it in the media, all it's trying to do is better quantify the warming effect of those emissions within the atmosphere, which again is very important to us as predominantly methane producers. I've just got a couple of slides here from a report that was commissioned on behalf of industry by Dr. Bradley Ridout, who I mentioned. So he's CSIRO principal scientist. And I think it's important to include a little bit of this information because it's probably what really triggered, I guess, a rethink at Cattle Australia around where we're sort of headed under CN30 and our emissions pathways. So this report was released, this report was titled Pathways to Climate Neutrality, and it was released in March last year, I think. And what it basically did was articulate and measure and quantify where we're at this point in time, where we've been, where we're at, and then with all of the modelled interventions in our emissions mitigation and sequestration strategies, where we might end up. And in that report, he measured obviously the pathways to a CN30 target, and then also alternative pathways through climate neutrality, which is based on an alternative metric, GWP star, and then some other radiative forcing metrics. And if you look at the graphs up there, basically the orange line, if we look at the carbon neutrality graph first, this is the predicted pathway. The orange line is historically where we've been, and that shows, I guess, the interventions that we've had as industry over the time. And then the blue line coming off that is the modelled line with all the interventions applied. As you'll see there, if you focus on, I guess, the zero baselines, the report basically said, carbon neutrality, we're not going to make it. We're going to miss it by about 17 megatons of CO2. And it should be noted that if you look at that blue line there, that's with all of the interventions modelled, including, I think, some 80% of that modelling relates to sort of reforestation and afforestation, I think, of around 10 million hectares of Australian farming landscape. So there's a bit of daunting stuff in there. On the right, the climate neutrality graph. So again, this is based on a metric that scientifically is proven to measure a gas like methane and its warming effect in a far better fashion. It shows, again, if you look at the zero baseline there, it shows that we're predicted to reach a point of climate neutrality by around 2028 as a red meat sector, and I think 2026 as a grass-fed cattle sector. And it should be noted that that is a huge milestone. I'm not actually aware of any other livestock sectors around the world who have actually reached a climate neutral point. I know our good friends at NCBA have a climate neutral 2040 target, I believe. And the point there is that the climate neutral methodology is becoming wider accepted around the world. But we see this as a very, very important point in time where basically beyond that line of zero, we can sell a product and we can claim that we're not actually adding any more atmospheric warming. No other sector can do that. When you think about big fossil emitters, they're always pumping it out. So they've got to find ways to sequester it to actually reduce their warming impact. So we're very, very unique in that regard. But I guess the key point in all of this is why we talk about carbon when we really predominantly deal in methane. These are just a few summary points that I put up there from Brad's report. There's increasing acknowledgement by the IPCC that the goals for short-lived gases are different to gases like CO2. Climate neutral shouldn't actually be considered a lesser target, and it's actually arguably more transparently aligned with the Paris Agreement. So remembering that the Paris Agreement was a temperature agreement, and something I think that really stuck in my mind when we hosted Miles Allen was that he said, all of the developed countries have been racing around trying to, solve the issue of global warming, slow climate change within a temperature-based target. But he said none of them are actually measuring the warming effect of their emissions. They're measuring the quantum of their emissions under a CO2 equivalency metric like GWP 100, but they're not actually measuring what they're doing in the atmosphere, which struck me as a little odd. A key point here: the ongoing use of a GWP 100 metric by the industry. Basically incorrectly or reinforces the misconception that we're big one-way emitters. This is how government account for us, but it's up to industry to change that narrative. And if we don't do it, nobody else is going to do that for us. Climate neutrality provides greater scope for producers to monetize their mitigation and sequestration. And when I think about that, probably in the light of what we do at home we have a soil carbon project that's registered under the Emissions Reduction Fund. And I'm a little bit alarmed by the conversation of sort of insetting versus offsetting that's come into the equation. We need to continue to enable producers to, monetize what they're doing, and acknowledging that, if you can sequester soil organic carbon in the soil that hasn't been there before, and you've had to change management to do that, that is a legitimate offset. That is a legitimate sequestration that hasn't acted there before. So we've got to be a little bit careful about. We have a choice as industry as to whether we make that part of a business as usual equation for us to maintain our supply chain relationships and effectively stay in business, or we continue to offer that as a service for industry. And then finally, that a climate neutral standard would provide greater scope for industry to grow and contribute to global food supplies. So we've spoken a bit about metrics, about regulation, policy and implications for industry. But I want to get back to how I started this off on this journey as a grass-fed producer. And, I reiterate, I'm no expert, but I'm very, very thankful that I've had experts in their field and climate scientists to sort of help me understand this scenario when I went down this rabbit hole. And it occurs to me that in our production landscapes that we currently have a lot of contradictions in how we account for emissions and the frameworks that are placed around them in terms of expectations around sequestration and mitigation. You think about the cows in glass boxes methodology. We put the cow in the box, we measure what comes out of her, and we set off on a path to sequester or mitigate all of those emissions. But cows don't exist in glass boxes, as you're all well aware of in this environment. And if we remove them from our environment, there are significant ramifications. So we have this biogenic carbon cycle, and yet we only account for the outgoing part of emissions. And it's a little bit like accounting for your business expenses without accounting for any income. Your balance sheet's not going to look real flash after a while. At home, I often think about when I was sort of starting to question some of this stuff, and at home we run a time-controlled grazing enterprise, so we essentially rotate one big mob of cows around and we hit grass hard, and then we rest it for long periods of time. We also share a boundary with the national park of about 10 kilometres, and that photo up there of the fire was a couple of years ago. I think in the 8 years we've been there, we've watched it burn 3 times and burn hot. So I haven't got another half hour to talk about conservation land and how we go about that, but that's a bit of a bone of contention. But if I look at it, for instance, a black speargrass plant on our side of the fence versus one in the national park, through the way we manage that grazing and stimulate that pasture growth, I'd estimate anecdotally that we might pull triple the biomass out of that plant. Whereas on the national park side, that plant will grow to full maturity in one season. It'll senesce, pop out a seed head, senesce, rot, and or more likely burn, as we see in the Australian landscape. Bushfires are actually part of fast carbon cycles in Australia and around the world. So fast carbon cycles are what they're referred to as bushfires, swamps, plant respiration, and decomposition. And it's interesting in Australia for the last decade or two that they've estimated, the estimations vary, but where I seem to settle on is that we emit around 300 to 400 million tonnes of carbon dioxide and carbon dioxide equivalent from fast carbon cycles. Now, they're not accounted for as part of our sort of anthropogenic or man-made emissions accounts because they're exactly what they say they are. They're a fast carbon cycle. So stuff burns, stuff rots, stuff regrows, and that carbon dioxide is pulled back into the out of the atmosphere. Canopy fires. There's plenty of research that says canopy fires, so the big intense fires we're seeing through some of our national parks and conservation areas, emit large amounts, obviously, of CO2, but also methane. So they emit, there's research there that shows that canopy fires emit double the methane emissions to a cooler, slower burn, which is huge in the context of a hotter, drier climate that we're looking at, and protecting our unique Australian flora and fauna. So we go very quickly from an emissions argument here to talking about biodiversity and ecology. And to me, and I know that when Angus was talking about the nature-related stuff, that's probably where we're going to end up. So emissions soon sort of pales into insignificance. Savanna burning, I think, is another contradiction, and I know that's probably pretty relevant to this part of the world, but it strikes me as very odd that we can essentially claim a credit under the ERF for burning something sooner rather than later, acknowledging I fully understand the ramifications for emissions and intensity in fire, but we can claim a credit for burning something sooner rather than later, and yet if we perform that same action with a cow, we essentially get penalised. So huge contradictions there. And I note, just flicking through the ERF methodology around savanna burning, that it specifically says we can't introduce livestock into those project areas. So a little bit odd to me. So the key point out of all that is why, and I guess the question I have is why we regard ruminant emissions from grass-fed livestock as anthropogenic or man-made if they follow the same basic cyclical principles of fast carbon cycles. And we're accounting for it over here, but we're not accounting for it over here. Globally, herbivore numbers have remained pretty constant, with the only real change between wild and domesticated. So again, we're talking about utilising a biomass here, and we need to think really carefully about how we measure and put implications around emissions sequestration around that. Kangaroos in Australia, I popped him in there because I came across a 2015 University of Wollongong study that it was long thought that kangaroos didn't really emit methane, and they had some superbug and some way of eating grass and not putting methane out into the atmosphere. On closer inspection, it appeared that they were wrong. Cattle don't have a rumen. They have a foregut, but lo and behold, the foregut contains very similar bacteria to what you find in a cow's rumen. Now, obviously, on a per-animal basis, a kangaroo emits a lot less methane than a cow. However, on a feed intake basis, they emit similar amounts as per the report. So, again, the argument against sort of, the more sustainable or ethical diet of consuming native animals kind of goes out the window there from an emissions perspective. So again, I guess the last contradiction I pulled out of there, and when you think about the graphs that were up earlier, the main, I guess, way that those graphs change over time and go up and down is related to our national herd. So when our national herd increases, so do our emissions. And we, in recent years, we're reporting on basically drought numbers, and we look really good, and we pat ourselves on the back and say, haven't we done a good job in reducing our emissions as Australian cattle producers? The next data set that comes out that might show the last few good years we've been through might show another story. But I'd ask you, why, if when our herd increases, or when our herd does increase, we essentially are just increasing our ability to grow grass, right? And when we grow extra grass, we sequester extra CO2. So I'm imagining that there's a parallel line there that does exactly that in good seasons, and then in dry seasons, conversely that. So we claim a credit when our livestock numbers are down, but in reality, we're probably just growing less grass and pulling less CO2 out of the atmosphere. So from my point of view, there are plenty of holes in the argument that cattle are net emitters, and that's where we need to take this argument, because we grow grass, we eat it, and then it grows back again. And I know there's all this, satellite monitoring and biomass monitoring in the room. I'm a pretty simple bloke. I just tell my kids to stand in the paddock there and come back a week later and then a month after that. But that's really, so again, a lot of this is anecdotal, but I think this is where we need to take the argument. So while a climate neutral target based on methodology that reflects our warming potential rather than flawed, what's been acknowledged as flawed CO2 equivalence methodology is good, I reckon we need to do better, and we've got a little ways to go. I came across a quote from a Dr. Christine Bayes, who's a Canada Research Chair in Livestock Genomics, and she said that the actual amount of methane that's released from a single blade of grass wouldn't change if it was left to decompose or if it was eaten by a cow and then digested by the bacteria in the gut. The only difference is that the methane would be released more quickly by an animal or other ruminant. So again, we're talking about the speed of a cycle. We're not necessarily talking about a net emissions increase. The biggest lever that we can continue to pull, and I think we've done a pretty bloody good job in Australia of, is improvement in productivity. And we've just got to be a little bit careful, I think, in terms of chasing silver bullets like feed additives, all of which play a part. But we need to, an HGP, for instance, is a pretty good climate mitigation tool. So we've got to continue investments in productivity. I don't know what's happened with the screen here. It's disappeared. I don't think it was me. No, that's all right. We'll keep going. And so, and again, finally, I think in the Australian context, we've just got to be a little bit careful about accepting EU definitions. And that's something we're working on at Cattle Australia at the moment in regards to the EU deforestation regulation that's coming. Again, when you think about, I guess, the FAO that originally came out and said, and put the cow in the glass box and said, we've got to offset all of those emissions. Perhaps it is more relative to a European style production model where animals will spend, 6 or 8 months a year in a barn, and all of the life cycle assessment considerations with that. This discussion is also important to greater society, and I'm sorry that I'm missing my slides up there. I only had a couple to get through. But I did have a little quote up there, and I off the top of my head, I could try it. It was around. It was from a Dr. Ian Anting, who is a climate scientist at the University of Adelaide, I think, here in Australia, and he said that using the focus on short-lived climate pollutants as a driver, I guess, of rapid progress in terms of emission policy is a bit like using a credit card to pay off pre-existing debt. It'll give you a short-term fix, but it just won't really won't solve the long-term problem. Oh, we're back. And I didn't get it. It was nothing like that. Anyway, you can read it. I reckon, well, we've moved on, so that's good. That was the previous slide, wasn't it? Yeah, no, that's where we're at. So again, just reiterating, I guess, that the discussion is important to greater society. And again, we've got lots of people saying that they're not advocates for our industry, but they think we need to look at it a lot harder. So policy and resulting regulation that focus on short-lived climate pollutants is taking the eye off the driver of the real driver of climate change, which is ever accumulating atmospheric concentrations of CO2. And remember, again, we're cycling carbon atoms. We're not adding new carbon atoms to the atmosphere. So just to finish up, what's coming at us? We've got the National Energy and Greenhouse Reporting Act. So this is Labor's sort of flagship industrial carbon reduction scheme for emitters over 100,000 tonne. And I know a lot of the big pastoral companies in the room are well aware of this one. And we've certainly had a lot of discussions at it at a national level. But basically what it means is that once you trigger that 100,000 tonne threshold, of which a lot of our pastoral companies will under current accounting methodology, there is mandatory reporting. We've got the methane pledge, came in a few years ago. A lot of you would have seen a bit about that. But that's whilst it's an aspirational pledge, it's actually a 30% reduction pathway for methane. And it's an absolute reduction, right? It's not, there's no mitigation or sequestration involved here. So that's a bit of a horrifying situation for industry. In recent weeks, you would have seen some news around the dietary guidelines, and the National Health and Medical Research Council are proposing to bring environmental sustainability into the whole scenario around dictating appropriate dietary guidelines. So we're front and centre in that argument. And again, we've got the ongoing discussion in industry around Scope 3 emissions, and Angus touched on that. But again, it's what are our Scope 3 emissions is the key point for me, and have they been grossly overestimated? We've been in recent consultation around the net zero sectoral plans. of which agriculture is one, and we've been deeply involved in that at a national level. But to be blunt, there was a bit of a condescending narrative, I think, from government within some of those discussion papers around this constant need to do more. As I said, we've done a hell of a lot of industry, but all we are asking for is a more of a level playing field so we can better understand where we are and get better recognition for what we've already done. So the ramifications of continuing down this path for industry and also greater society, as I've pointed out, are fairly considerable. There are plenty of missing pieces, and there are plenty of questions that need answers. But we've got to continue to put our head above the parapet here and call out inequity. We've got to continue to prove our credentials, which I think we've done a pretty good job of. And if we can set them in the right light, then they'll be even better. We've got to take meaningful action that centres around a sound scientific basis for a rethink. Globally, livestock sectors have been really poor at advocating for what we do, and we've had a lot of discussion about that here this morning. We're pretty good at doing what we do. We're just not very good at telling others how we do it or why we should maintain the right to do it. So again, we've got to be a little bit careful also, I think, and wary a little bit of the juggernaut that is the climate change industry. There's a lot of money flowing around, whole careers are built on it, and you've only got to look at the energy sector there to see some of the rapidly evolving unintended consequences around large sums of money. So I guess at a Cattle Australia, just to finish up at a Cattle Australia level and the national level, we're really having a serious rethink about this stuff, and core of that is, what is our net zero? And that really came to light through the sectoral plan discussions. And, net zero is traditionally a term that focuses on large CO2 emitters, one-way emitters, being that they have to reach a point where all of their emissions are either offset or sequestered or mitigated. As we've discussed here today, we have a huge ability to sequester large amounts of carbon CO2 in our landscapes and our production systems. And it's important to note that no other sector has the ability to do that. So I guess that's where we're headed. And I'm pleased to announce, as of last week at Cattle Australia, we've made a determination to basically have a bit of a reset. We're doing a bit of stuff around the deforestation and the land management piece of the EUDR regs. And part of that was, I guess, instigating a whole of industry roundtable, whole supply chain roundtable, financiers, regulators, etc., to just get everyone in the room and determine where we need to take this going forward. And I know Chris might talk about that more this afternoon. But that's going to be a key part of where we are. It's not necessarily, as I said, we've done a lot. We've had a very ambitious emissions target, CN30. But at this point, it's probably more about just taking pause, taking stock, and realising where we are and perhaps evaluating where we are in the need for a fair and level sort of playing field. So that's about it from me. I hope I've given you something to think about, and look forward to the discussion going on from here. As I said, Gary Edwards, our chair, is in the room. Chris Parker's here, and he'll talk more later, so feel free to reach out. Thank you.